like to say good afternoon to everyone. I will try to not keep you too long. I have basically we're going to look at one of the miracles of Jesus and consider a few thoughts, not too many, but we will consider the wonder of this miracle and Jesus basically changing a man's life. So if you will turn with me to John the 9th chapter, we will have our opening reading. There in John the 9th chapter, starting with verse 1, it says, "And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man may work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground, and he made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way, therefore, and he washed, and he came seeing. The neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him that was blind, said, Is this not he that sat and begged? Some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. But he said, I am he. Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? And he answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay, and he anointed my eyes, and he said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. I went and I washed, and I received sight. Then they said unto him, Where is he? He said, I know not. They brought the Pharisees, him that aforetime, they brought to him the Pharisees, to him that was blind. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And again the Pharisees also asked him how he received the sight. He said unto them, He put clay on mine eyes, and I washed, and I do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. They say unto the blind man again, What sayest thou of him that he hath opened thine eyes? He said, He is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind, and he received his sight, until they called the parents of him that received his sight. They asked him, saying, Is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now see, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man does confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, Give God the praise, we know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. But one thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him again, What did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciples. Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know what God spake unto Moses, and as for this fellow, we know not from whence he comes. The man answered and said unto them, Why, herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he has opened mine eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, it is not heard that any man had opened the eyes of one that was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered and said unto him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he had found him, he said unto him, Dost thou also believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. And Jesus said, For judgment I am come into the world, that they which see not might see, and they which see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and they said unto him, Are we blind also? Jesus said unto him, If you were blind, you should have no sin. But now you say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth. Well, we see here a great miracle was conducted. A man born blind, and yet now he sees. And how amazing it was, we see to the people in the story, how shocked and awe they were. And they were like, how could this have happened? How is this even possible? And yet we find, despite that, there was those who mumbled against it. Those who said, maybe God opened this man's eyes, but this man, he's a sinner. And they said things like that. And so this afternoon we're going to delve a little bit into this and consider this occurrence, this event, and this great miracle that Jesus had done. But before we go further, we have an honor and a privilege to go to God in a word of prayer. So let's do that at this time. Well, we might consider the estate of this man before he had been healed by Jesus. You might find yourself in certain situations throughout this life, but perhaps you've never had a situation where people walk by you and they wag their heads and they look down on you and they consider to themselves, look at this pitiful state that this person is in. It's their own fault, and they have brought it upon themselves, and they walk by you without giving you any mercy or any kindness whatsoever. I don't know the situations of everyone here, but maybe you had been in that situation before. But I think we can see how terrible it was for this blind man. And here comes Jesus, of course, and Jesus has compassion and he has mercy upon this man. Well, the story opens with a curious conversation. You might say is a conversation many of the day had in their mind. Why did this misfortune happen upon this man that he was born blind? Of course, we must consider that a blind man in Jesus' age was much worse off than one in ours. Not to say it's all sunshine and roses for those who are blind in our age, but we must consider that in Jesus' time, there was no invention of Braille. There was no such thing as a seeing eye dog that we know of. There was no social safety nets that the government would have to give these men like we have Social Security today. And so this man was a beggar laying on the street, and he was hoping that a passerby would give him money and aid. That was his livelihood. That was the way that he had to eat. He would have to ask for money to whoever it was. And of course, being blind, he really just had to shout out whenever he heard someone walk by. Well, the Pharisees crossed such men. They looked down upon them, and they considered them to be sinners who deserved their predicament. They considered them deserving of this estate. Now, I'm not sure why this thought had prevailed, but it could come from an odd interpretation of Exodus, the 34th chapter, in verse 7. There in Exodus 34, verse 7, it says, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and upon the children's children unto the third and fourth generation. Of course, I'm just speculating here why they might have thought such a thing, but if they had used that verse to say, visiting the father's iniquity on their children, on their children's children, this is why the man is blind, because somewhere in his lineage there was lots of sin and God was punishing them for that. They're missing really the real whole point of that verse, because that verse is about God's great mercy and how he forgives iniquity. It could have also been in Leviticus chapter 21 and verse 18. I'm not going to read that, but you can read that if you want. But essentially the priests were in the tabernacle were to not have a certain disabilities. And so they might have considered, that means that those who are of those disabilities must be sinful because they cannot be a priest in the tabernacle. Yet Jesus dispels this myth that even the apostles at this time seem to have bought into. This man did no sin to cause his blindness. Neither did his father or his mother. No, in fact, it came upon him at least as the verse says, for the glory of this day when the Christ should heal him and believe. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that God had purposely made this man blind so Jesus could heal him, but as we know, God will use our weaknesses. He will use our deficiencies for His glory, and so it was the case with this blind man. You know, it is an odd thing that masters of the law would buy into such ideas when the book of Job existed. You know, Job, of course, was a man who suffered. He suffered greatly, and it was not because of him sinning. In fact, we find he rather was found of God to be a righteous man. And so we should keep this to heart, since even in our day, sometimes this idea still lingers. We should be careful to judge a man and consider his circumstances due to his actions we might ascribe as evil or sinful. Now, sin does have consequences, and there are times when a man, by his sin, may be in a certain situation that is not a good situation. But we also know, and we see sometimes evil happens upon men for other reasons than because they have sinned. Now, interestingly enough, it seems as though Jesus spoke these words while in the presence of this man, seeing how Jesus spat on the ground as soon as Jesus had finished talking. Now, I wonder how the man felt when he heard the words spring forth from a stranger that he was not blind because he was a sinner, nor was it his parents' fault. I wonder if he cried when he finally realized that the one who said this was the Christ, putting to rest any doubt to this statement. He had, after all, lived a life where men would pass by him, treating him as if he had done something horribly wrong. He was not just disabled in this society, but he was an outcast. Well, this man who had kind words for him put a salve upon his eyes that was made of spit and mud, and he told him to wash, and so he did. When he had then obeyed, he was able to see. He returned with his sight to those who knew him, and they were astonished. This man born blind, who sat and begged, how is it that he can now see? Is it really him? He answered them, I am the one who was born blind. A man named Jesus had healed me. Now this made a bit of a commotion, and so the man was brought before the Pharisees. They questioned him about Jesus and how he was healed. Of course, they knew who Jesus was, and they despised what had occurred because it was on the Sabbath day, but also probably because they had already in their hearts despised Jesus. Some of them reasoned that Jesus was a sinner and he broke the Sabbath law. Others among them, however, said, how could a sinner do what he did? Well, this back and forth goes on for some time. First, they check to make sure that this man is not lying, that he's not an imposter. Confirm with his parents that he was indeed born blind. Then they approach the man to inform him to praise God and forget about Jesus, essentially, because they claim Jesus is a sinner. You know, what they're saying here is, maybe it's possible that God somehow just had compassion on you and opened your eyes, but it had nothing to do with Jesus. Forget about him. He is a sinner. And that's essentially what they were trying to tell him. Well, during this talk, however, we see something interesting take place. The man who was healed rebukes the ignorance of the Pharisees. He does it subtly, but it surely stung to these ears of the Pharisees. If you'll read with me just a bit back in verse 24 through 34 of our reading in John chapter 9, it says, Then again called they the man that was blind and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or not, I know not. One thing I do know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Then they said unto him again, What did he to thee? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. We know that God spoke unto Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know from whence he is. The man answered and said unto him, Why, herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. Then answered they and said unto him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. Now, a few things to consider here. What a marvel that these men do not know from whence Jesus came. Yet he opened the eyes of the blind. Now, what this blind man offers is likely something he knew very intimately. Since the world began, it was unheard of that anyone had restored sight to the blind. In fact, you might find it curious that in the Old Testament, we find recorded no such miracle. No blind man had been given his sight by any of the prophets. We know of many great miracles in the power of God in the Old Testament, yet we read of no healing of the eyes of the blind. We know an occasion when temporary blindness was handed out. For instance, when the angels had blinded the men in Sodom and Gomorrah when they came to Lot's house, but not a man born blind receiving sight. And so you might consider that for a moment, living in those times, being a faithful Jew, born blind, and you're treated the way that we had described already, as a sinner, as someone who was terrible. Either you or somebody related to you did horrible sins, and that's why you're born blind. And knowing, there's really no cure for this as far as you understand it. There's no medicine that can open your eyes, and of course, you haven't heard of the prophets doing such as well. And so we see a little more there, the terrible state of this man before Jesus had come into his life. Well, there are some instances in the Old Testament, however, that do describe the healing of the eyes of the blind. We find in Psalms chapter 146, verse 8, it says, The Lord opened the eyes of the blind, the Lord raised them that are bowed down, the Lord loveth the righteous. In Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 5, it says, Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. In Isaiah chapter 29, verse 18, it says, And in that day shall the deaf hear the words of the book, and the eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness. And then I want to read a few verses in Isaiah chapter 42. It says there in Isaiah 42, verse 1, Behold my servant, whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. I put my spirit upon him, and he shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth a judgment unto truth. He shall not fail, nor be discouraged, till he hath set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. Thus saith God the Lord, He that created the heavens and stretched them out, He that spread forth the earth, and that which cometh out of it, He that giveth breath unto the people upon it, and the spirit to them that walk therein. I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and will give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light to the Gentiles, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. So we see in prophecy, especially regarding the prophecy surrounding the coming Messiah, healing of the blindness is something that is indeed attributed to God, and it is talked about in the Old Testament. Of course, we understand it can be a metaphor for accepting truth over error in some of these verses, but we know Jesus also used miracles to teach a spiritual message. He, unlike the other prophets, unlike Moses, whom they proudly cited to be followers of, can open the eyes of the blind. And so we see what this blind man was truly saying. You know, how marvelous it is that they don't know where Jesus has come from, and yet he hath opened the eyes of the blind. You know, if they had read their own scriptures, perhaps they would have understood where Jesus had come from. We should note this was also a courageous confession of this man. He stood opposed to the Pharisees, fully knowing what was about to happen. The verse says they threw him out. They threw him out. That is, the penalty discussed in this verse was given to him likely by members of the Sanhedrin court. So the Sanhedrin court was a body of authority that could do certain things to people in that age. Many of the Pharisees were part of that court of the Sanhedrin. And they of course, as you probably are well aware, were the one who had condemned Jesus to the cross. In a sense, well, obviously the Romans had done that, but the Sanhedrin court conspired to have him killed. But they had the power to do things like that, the penalty of death for certain things they deemed as crimes, and they also had the penalty to exile you, essentially. And so this is what they did to this man here. They exiled him. He was no longer a part of their society by law. It shows in verse 22, the Jews had already agreed that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. And so that's what they did to this blind man. But Jesus finds the man. Surely he could find comfort in his predicament despite now being upgraded from an informal outcast to now a legal exile. In Isaiah chapter 66, verse 5, it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, ye that tremble at his word. Your brethren that hateth you, that cast you out for my name's sake, said, Let the Lord be glorified, but he shall appear to your joy, and they shall be ashamed." What a verse to underscore perhaps what this man had gone through on this occasion. And so Jesus finds the man again. And as for their conversation, I think we can now appreciate the beauty of it all the more. The man who lived a life as a pitiful beggar, healed by and accepted by a stranger, he defends the stranger, knowing intimately that only God can heal the blind, and none, not even Moses, had ever done that. For his defense of this man, he is now cast out of the synagogue by this Jewish authority. But there alone in his predicament, the Savior appears to him. In verses 35 to 38, it says, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when they had found him, he said unto him, Dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talked with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Now, what a beautiful end to this story. Now, I would like to end it here, but Jesus had one more interaction with the Pharisees. Apparently, despite casting out the man, they are nearby, and they hear this conversation that Jesus has with the blind man. They ask Jesus if they are blind also, since Jesus told the blind man he would make the blind see and those who can see blind. Well, Jesus replies to them, If you were blind, then you would be in a better position. But they claim that they can see, therefore they are in error and in sin. Well, the Pharisees believed the common man was blind and knew not the way of God, especially those who were Gentiles or who had dealings with the Gentiles. We see this is a parable. We see this in the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. In Luke chapter 18, verses 11 through 13, it says, The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much of his eyes unto heaven, but he smote upon his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. And so we see this was the attitude of these Pharisees. They considered everyone else to be blind but them, that they were special in God's eyes. And they said, I thank you for making me this way. But we see Jesus, of course, had a different opinion of them than they had of themselves. We know that one that was blind to his own sin, but the other recognized it and he addressed it. Thus did Jesus make the blind see, and those who claim to see blind. Now, further to this, Jesus spoke of people who were in darkness and could not see. The Gentiles would know light because of Jesus. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, it says, The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath light shined. And of course, we read earlier in Isaiah chapter 42, verses 6 through 7, it says, I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light to the Gentiles, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. What a wonderful and glorious thing to consider Jesus, that light which opens our eyes, that cures our blindness. Stuart had talked this morning about how we should be students of the Bible, that we should be diligent in our studies. And we shouldn't consider it as being sort of a homework. We shouldn't consider it as something to be a burden. And I think we can see from this illustration exactly how we can adopt that mindset, because we don't want to be blind. Nobody wants to be blind. And if we have that light that can open our eyes, then surely we would grasp to that. Surely we would want to pour that into our eyes so that we can see as clearly as possible. And the words of Jesus written in the Bible, that is that light. That is that light to us. Technically, we are Gentiles. So we're not Jews. We're not those of the lineage of Abraham by blood, though we might be of that of the Spirit through baptism. We are Gentiles. And so when it's talking about that great light that has shone to them, we must be thankful to God that He has brought that to us, that we might be saved.